Future Hacker Life Path Future.
Welcome back, everybody. This is the second episode with Kathleen Wu, that is Future Hacker, and I'm your host, Maria Taiji. So I've been talking to Kath about, the use of artificial intelligence specifically for HR. So for, hiring people and talent management. Kath has been sharing a lot of rich information. If you haven't heard the first episode, please do. Welcome back, Kath.
Awesome. Glad to be back.
So moving ahead, how can we use technology to solve the gap of minorities in general, not only gender, but, religion and different cultures, getting promoted to executive roles? We're used to see, and this being very discussed, how, white guys are usually on the top level of companies. How can we actually be using technology in a smart way to make it more inclusive to minorities as well?
That's a very, very good question, Maria. And it's something I think that a lot of AI researchers are still grappling with. Quite recently, there was some controversy with an AI ethicist in Google called Timnit and some of her papers regarding machine learning implementation. And I think overall, it's really a reality that a lot of technology providers would need to reckon with sooner or later. So I troll a lot of the forums, scan a lot of the information for a lot of the AI studies on Facebook, on Reddit. And one of the common things I see among researchers is the thinking that this isn't exactly a real problem. So a few researchers feel like if you add a variable to consider a woman or a minority, you're just biasing the algorithm or you're changing what the math is telling. But what's often ignored is since machine learning is dependent on data, a lot of the inputs would be based on historical trends. And history has shown that there's a lot of societal inequities that we're still grappling with up to today in some shape or form. So if we're not careful, we can eventually develop algorithms that have the same societal biases. But this time, we would have at least a more difficult time finding accountability around it. One of the really good examples that I love to share around this is really the case where Chase Bank, JP Morgan in the US, was employing an algorithm to find the US-based terrorists who were planning attacks. And one of the factors that they isolated was terrorists were more likely to withdraw or deposit cash from different ATMs. So they implemented it on the algorithm, they run it, and what they found was a lot of young women were suddenly complaining to their Chase bankers that their accounts were flagged for some reason. And what the researchers found was they were actually flagging prostitutes in the New York area. And the surprising thing about it was because prostitutes shared similar behavior as terrorists. And this is just probably a small, somewhat interesting challenge for an algorithm. But as we as a society get more and more dependent on algorithms, a lot of these challenges are going to compound and they're going to start affecting more and more sectors in society. So everything from getting your first bank loan to getting your first credit card, buying your first house, a lot of this will be more influenced by algorithms than ever before. And there's a danger of inequities becoming stronger because we weren't deliberate in terms of how we made those decisions. So when you look at the research that's out there today, not many people have a deliberate framework for how to move forward, but it's created a position called AI ethics, where you have researchers who are specialized in just analyzing how certain algorithms make decisions and finding ways to improve them. And one of the things that's very interesting for me is when you look at how algorithms are implemented today, what we take for granted is it's math for sure, It's a bit more exact than how people normally make decisions, fair enough. But it's essentially one perspective of one researcher put into an automatic machine. And because it's one perspective, there's a danger of gaps in thinking, gaps in decision-making, gaps that reinforce a lot of the challenges and inequities that we experience in society today. So one way to combat that is really to use different algorithms for the same tasks and have the algorithms make decisions together, but also learn when there is a difference in the decision making that they do. So one example is something called generative adversarial networks, or GANs. And they're basically two algorithms given the same tasks, and they're asked to basically fight each other in a zero-sum game. And what happens from this process is you're able to gather information and training that's richer than if you just train an algorithm on a piece of data. You're able to see where algorithms make decisions similarly. You're able to see where they make decisions differently. But definitely as we move towards a more algorithm-driven society, especially with how the coronavirus pandemic is shaping up, we're going to need a lot more thinkers and a lot more analytical processes among the workforce today. So instead of implementing an algorithm without really thinking about it, we're going to need to really practice the process of thinking through how we make decisions and what are the implications based on how we make these decisions. And I think it presents an exciting opportunity for the workforce. There's an opportunity, of course, to level up how we think, how we plan, and how we make choices. But there's also the opportunity to grow our skill sets, where people are no longer treated as experts in the field, but we're looked at as there's always an opportunity for beginners to learn different fields, integrate learnings from different fields together, and improve their learning in the process. So in a sense, integrative thinking.
So Kath, let me see if I understood it right. So basically, going back to how the algorithms work, right? So you say that specifically about your solution, you not only help to choose the best candidate for a job, you also tell the leader which type of incentive should be offered to a current employee. And you can even predict when a higher performer is about to leave the company. But you're just telling us all those variables that we need to be aware. And I just loved your example about, the misuse of the AI and how this company was trying to fight terrorists and ended up finding prostitutes. So taking all of that in consideration, we know that each person has their own purposes, their own motivation. So how does it work? How can you actually make all those predictions considering all those variables in there? As much as we need to keep in mind that the best way is to have a very diverse team behind it. So you consider the differences in cultures and in beliefs and everything around that. But how can you actually offer this service with so many variables in place?
So that's a really good question. A lot of the time, we're really unconscious in terms of how current systems like Facebook and Google are collecting data from us. So when you install a new app on your phone, they collect your location data, they collect the make of your phone, how long, what's your user credentials, who your friends are, who your contacts are. And the value of all of these information paints a picture of how you look like, and as they paint a more comprehensive picture of you, they're more likely to tell, or at least to be able to tell, how likely you are to behave in a certain way or make decisions in a certain way. And the funny thing about it is a lot of these data are primarily used to sell us things. And one of the things that really struck me is you're collecting all this information on Facebook or on LinkedIn, perhaps even on Google, and you're primarily using it to, in a sense, manipulate the person into a certain behavior. why not use those kinds of information to enrich our personal experiences? Why not use that information to personalize the employment process, as well as we personalize the Netflix video feed or the YouTube feed or the Facebook feed? Why can't we use that data to enrich the process and the interactions that we go through in our daily lives? And for me, that thought really struck me. And moving forward, I realized as we go through what we've gone through recently, particularly in the US, with what happened on January 6th and so on, what we're really seeing is people are as much influenced by technology as technology is influenced by people. We're seeing an evolution in technology where it's actually changing the way we live, the way we make decisions, and the way we go about our lives. And at some point, some people, because of the technology they use, are actually experiencing different realities than the majority of us, because the algorithms that they use reinforce their beliefs instead of challenging them to look at different viewpoints. And for me, when you think about those implications, what it means is a technology is really only as good as the people or how it's implemented around people. And the implication of that is a lot of the companies who use these data right now have a responsibility as well to make sure that the data is used in a way that adds value to different societies, instead of takes value away and creates divisiveness. And as you said, a lot of the time, collecting a lot of these variables can be challenging. So in Rumarocket in particular, we have a policy where we share the value of what the person can get from providing the data before we ask them to provide the data. So thinking about it moving forward, especially, I think recently there was this challenge with WhatsApp where the platform needs to share data with Facebook starting from a certain date. And Elon Musk tweeted something like use Signal. And suddenly the stock price of the company increased so much as users got on the platform. And what this shows us is really there's a lack of trust for a lot of these companies who handle our data today. And what this means is there's really an opportunity to rebuild that trust as we move forward. And for us, our thinking is really, instead of focusing on collecting as many variables, we try to add value bit by bit and get people to commit their data openly and build ownership towards how they use the tool, instead of just collecting the information without their consent.
Thank you so much. You know, Kath, I love that you give such a good background in all your answers. A lot of rich information in here. Thank you so much for that. Let's change the topic a little. When I asked you about how your company was affected during 2020, you told me the following: the nature of adding value has changed after COVID. And that's a great statement, right? I'd like to dig more a little into that. Within your markets and from your experience, what has changed and how did it affect your business, and how were you able to turn around and transform this into an opportunity?
That's a very good question. I love the quote. I don't remember saying it, but I hopefully sounded smart.
You did say that. It sounded brilliant, you know?
So let's explore that a bit further. So prior to COVID, a lot of companies were moving towards something called digital transformation. So a lot of expensive consultants would get lined up. They would develop a technology plan. They would talk about it and do a roadshow about it. And then they would tell their shareholders about it. And it would mean that the company was suddenly one of the cutting edge companies in the industry, employing, it's usually the same buzzwords, artificial intelligence or machine learning to predict XYZ and change the world and all that. And then COVID happened. And one of the things we realized quickly was instead of digitalization becoming an option, it was becoming a necessity for more and more companies to survive. So a good example would be restaurants. So when the lockdowns happened, a lot of the restaurants closed down initially. And those who survived were the restaurants who were able to reinvent themselves from a brick and mortar channel, to an online channel. And they were the businesses, the restaurants that really made an effort to understand their value. So when you think restaurants, most people say, okay, I usually go to my favorite restaurants because of the food. But beyond that, the best restaurants actually sell an experience. They sell an immersion of you sitting in this beautiful place, enjoying your meal, watch people watching, and, interacting in a generally beautiful environment. And the restaurants, when they moved to an online channel, realized that they were going to need to differentiate on something more beyond food. So you had a lot of them partnering with transport companies, like Grab, Food Panda here in Asia, and so on, to deliver their food. But they also evolved how they presented their food. So instead of one dish, they did group meals. So you could share it with your friends, your family members. And they really looked at how they could sell an experience as opposed to just selling food. And those digital transformations have happened in different ways, in different forms, across different countries as COVID has ravaged our societies. And when you look at those kinds of digital transformations, they were done quickly. They were done in an agile way. People looked beyond their initial job descriptions and decided to change the way they did things. So waiters became more familiar with using things like Grab, using things like food delivery services, interacting with drivers, doing logistics for food transportation, and so on. And they learned new skills to adapt to the challenges of COVID. So what this means is that more often than not, when you digitalize, you also need to be agile. You need to be able to empower your team members on the ground to think on their feet, instead of waiting for an instruction to come in. Well, another good example would be the supermarkets during the onset of lockdown. So during the onset of lockdown in the Philippines, they cut off the number of people who could be in a supermarket at the same time. So during the first week, you saw really, really long lines. But then you also saw that some supermarkets started to differentiate from each other. So they offered a service where you could order your groceries online and just go in and pick up. So you didn't need to stay long and do the shopping where you're walking around from aisle to aisle. And what you saw immediately was people were frustrated by the lines. So the supermarkets who innovated actually captured a more significant market base. And they grew instead of contracting during the pandemic. So digitalization combined with people agility has actually redefined what it means to embrace technology, especially in an uncertain time like now. So it's really the focus of implementing cutting-edge AI, but also not forgetting that the fundamentals of what make a business work is really its people, how the people interact and how the people make decisions on a day-to-day basis. And that's what really redefines how we've evolved at this time. So once we realized that, Rumarocket started offering services around people agility and having AI encourage agile habits among team members. So encouraging them to think through challenges, encouraging them to ask questions. And once we deployed that, we were able to get a lot of demand for our services. So when the pandemic started, we had millions of pesos in clients back out on us. We were in trouble for a while, but then we applied agile and we adapted our technology to the challenges that companies were facing in a new environment. And in the process, I would say we were lucky to survive, but we also made the deliberate effort to make sure that we were able to survive and move forward.
Thanks, Kath. You know what? Unfortunately, we're getting to the end of the show. But, I don't want to end it before asking you, what's your plan for this year after all the roller coaster that you went through? And, how do you think that this market is going to look like, let's say, 30 years from now? And finally, if you could end your interview, giving the future hackers out there any final words and advices, it would be great as well.
I guess I'll start by telling you the story of how I spent yesterday glued to YouTube watching the inauguration of President Joe Biden. One of the interesting things from his speech was this point that this 22-year-old girl, I think she's a very young and very talented Nobel laureate. And the poem was moving in the sense that it talked about people's capacity to fail and people's capacity to be small, but it didn't negate the person's capacity to improve and to get better. And when you think about people in general and how we work together as a society, it's easy to see the negatives because they're so blatant in front of us. We see when people act irrationally, when things don't make sense, when corporations betray the trust of their customers and their employees. But what we don't see behind the scenes is there's also an improvement that's been happening constantly over the last 200 years. We've been moving forward slowly as a society. And for me, that contradiction has always been something that I've appreciated about the human condition. We have the capacity to be petty, to make mistakes, to cause havoc, to hurt each other, but we also have the capacity to improve and the capacity to get better and the capacity to move forward as a society towards better things. And for me, that's really the critical point of what happened over the last year and beyond that. Right now, we've reached the tipping point where more and more people are dying every day because of the pandemic. And once upon a time, we also had a pandemic in the 1920s and in the 1800s. And those times usually meant a turning point for how we made decisions and how we moved forward as a people. And for me, we're at a critical point. So I'm a millennial, and people normally say that millennials are the youngsters of this generation, but actually we're moving towards our 30s already, and there's a new generation called Zoomers who are coming into the workforce and really bringing their idealism moving forward. And looking back on my entrepreneurial career, I've been idealistic, I've been cynical, but I realized over time that the real balance is in between those two states. There's always gonna be bad, but there's also always gonna be good. And as long as I'm willing to move forward, get up every day and push things a little bit forward, things will happen, things will change. And me, in my own little way, I have a capacity to make things happen and add value to the lives of the people around me. So beyond that, I guess for me, it's really about choosing your meaning on a day-to-day basis. We live in an uncertain time, and a lot of the time, it's easy to follow the dictates of society. Get a good education, get a good job, profit, and probably retire somewhere in between. But the reality for anyone aspiring to be a future hacker is that the future is always going to be uncertain. There's going to be so many undefines, and there's going to be people who hurt and who wreak havoc and who are selfish or greedy. And that's not going to change. But if we as a people decide to add value in our own little way, we can be part of moving the human race forward. We can be part of the group 200 years from now looking back and saying, at this critical point in this pandemic, a group of people decided to make things better instead of running after profit for profit's sake. And at that point, it made all the difference. Thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in this podcast. And yeah, I hope that our discussion was something that would be useful to your listeners.
Kath, that was beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much. And the doors will be open for you. If you have anything new to share with us, please just shoot me a message, because I'm sure that my listeners will be dying to hear you again. Thank you, and all the luck for you on your business. Thanks a lot, Kath.
Future Hacker. Life. Path. Future.